We all tell ourselves stories about who we are, but what if the most fundamental story, the one that's literally written in our DNA, isn't quite as set in stone as we've been led to believe? Today, we're going to dive into this idea of how we might just be able to redefine our own genetic story.
So let's just jump right in with a massive question. Are your genes your destiny? This gets to the very heart of our health, our potential, everything. And the answer? Well, it's a lot more complex and, honestly, way more empowering than you might think.
All right, first up, let's talk about the common way we see our genetic story. Think of it like the script we're all handed at birth, this biological narrative that seems to have so much of our lives already mapped out. For most of us, this is pretty much the default setting, right? You look at your family, you see certain patterns, maybe health issues, and you just assume, well, that script is my script now. And look, let's be real, genetics are an incredibly powerful biological reality. But what this explainer is digging into is a different layer. It's the story we tell ourselves about that script and how our beliefs might just change the whole plot.
But this is where that script gets a really fascinating twist. The source material points out that, yeah, our genes carry memory, but they are not static files. They are literally designed to survive and, this is the important part, to adapt. That capacity for adaptation, that's everything.
So that leads us right into our next big idea. Trying to separate what is an absolute truth from what is a deeply held belief. Because if that genetic script has a built-in ability to adapt, then we've got to start questioning how tightly we're clinging to it.
And this really gets to the heart of the whole thing. On one hand, you have the accepted story. Certain genetic conditions are just incurable facts of life. But on the other hand, there's this really radical question. What if some of these facts are actually powerful belief systems that we've just accepted as the truth?
And these beliefs, they don't just pop up out of thin air. They're passed down from sources we're taught to trust without question. Family patterns, opinions from experts, even the official scientific definitions from authoritative sources that label something as incurable.
Okay, so let's get into this. Because if our beliefs are that powerful, you got to wonder, how does that even work? How does our perception actually start to create our reality, especially on a biological level?
So there is this really fascinating concept called biomimetic mimicry. I know, it sounds super technical, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It's when we unconsciously imitate the patterns around us, especially the suffering we see in our own family. It's kind of like you unconsciously take on your dad's anxiety about money, not because you inherited an anxiety gene, but because you've just absorbed his pattern as your own reality.
And here's how a pattern like that can really take hold. First, you just observe it. Let's say it's a family pattern of chronic pain. You see how it limits the people you love. Then, without even knowing it, you start to identify with it, thinking, oh, that's just a thing in our family. And finally, you might find yourself subconsciously recreating that same pattern in your own life, basically locking it in as your truth.
Which all circles back to a really powerful question. If millions of people believe something, even if they're all experts, does that automatically make it an absolute, unchangeable truth? Or does it just make it a very, very convincing story?
All right, so if we can start to question the old story, what's next? Well, it's about changing the labels we stick on ourselves. This whole section is about rewriting our internal definitions of who we are and what we're really capable of.
Just think about this for a second. We throw around terms like mental weakness as if it's some permanent part of someone's character. But what if we just reframed that? What if it's not who you are, but simply a temporary state you happen to be experiencing right now? That little shift in language, it's huge.
And the same exact thing goes for other really profound feelings. The source material talks about the idea of loneliness. You might feel absolutely, completely alone in whatever you're going through. But that feeling, as incredibly real as it is a perception. It's a state of being, not an objective physical reality. It's the lens you're looking through, not the unchangeable fact of your existence. And just realizing the difference between the perception and the reality, that's the first huge step toward changing it.
So how do we actually make this practical? How do we go from just understanding this stuff to actually writing a new script for our own lives? Well, it all starts with the practice of letting go. See, this kind of transformation isn't something that just happens to you. It starts with a very conscious, very deliberate choice. It's the decision to stop judging yourself for these patterns and to actively choose to release the ones that just aren't serving you anymore. And the process itself can be pretty simple. Step 1, just look at your thoughts and your patterns, but with all the usual judgment. Just observe them. Step 2, genuinely ask yourself, am I actually willing to let this go?
In step 3, just by asking that question, you create a little bit of space, a void, where a totally new possibility, a new reality has room to show up.
And that brings us right to the end. This whole journey of redefining our story, it all comes down to this one very personal question. It's not just about what science says is possible, it's about what you choose to believe is possible for yourself. So I'll leave you with this. What story are you ready to let go of?